Warning: this documentary presents photographic evidence of violence that may not be appropriate for part of the audience. We recommend warning viewers about this. A warning of heavy snowfall has been issued in the Midwest states. Along with severe frost this week, blizzards broke out in central Wisconsin. A 10-day roe deer hunting season was opened in the state, in the first 2 days of which 6 hunters died. 5 died from accidental shots, 1 from a heart attack. The police are examining the terrible finds found in the house of Master Ed Gein, who lives in the Plainfield area of the city, who confessed today that he gutted and dismembered the body of 58-year-old widow Bernice Worden. Authorities found a decapitated body suspended in Gein's woodshed. The entrails were removed from the body, and the body was suspended by the heel tendons. During the search of the Gein farm, the skin from the face of 54-year-old Marie Hogan was also found, as well as body parts of the other 10 victims found in a terrible pile of human body parts. 10 skulls, pieces of furniture made of human skin, a box with noses, tanned skin from human skulls, a belt made of female nipples, a small skull, most likely a 6-year-old child. The authorities also suspect the fact of cannibalism. Ed Gein, the Leinfeld ghoul. We remember the 50s in the form of a kind of smoky nostalgia of Ozzie and Gary. In the 50s, we had a feeling that everything would be fine from now on. It was like a drug. It was the era of Doris Day and all those soft sentimental songs. In my opinion, this is very important as the background of Gein's story, namely the kind of puritanical spirit of sexual prohibition that prevailed in these times. You see, it was an era of cultural prohibitions, when, for example, it was not allowed to demonstrate on TV that married couples sleep in the same bed. That's why Gein's crime came as such a terrible shock to people. Ed Gein lived in the small town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. Plainfield was on the fringe, an almost unknown city in the middle of the wilderness, and its population has never exceeded 600 or 800 people. This part of Wisconsin was considered the worst passable, and was sometimes called the Great Dead Heart of the state. Gein lived at a considerable distance from the city itself. Studying Gein's life, you feel his complete isolation from any human communication, with the exception of his crazy mother. At first, they lived together with their alcoholic and violent father, Dr. John Russell, forensic psychologist. Ed's mother was very domineering and fanatically religious and sought to minimize the communication of Ed and his brother Henry with the outside world, because there were a lot of sinners outside, and Gasta Gein was a recognized authority for her 2 sons, forbidding them all communication with the outside world, especially with women. What is most characteristic of all, she was pathologically opposed to everything related to sex. Ed grew up with very, very contradictory feelings for his mother. On the one hand, he consciously idolized and revered her, seeing her as a goddess-like figure, but on another unconscious level, he increasingly felt resentment and hatred for his mother. The debate about whether a sociopath is born or becomes one does not subside. Personally, I think that Ed Gein's very tense home environment gives a clear argument in favor of the fact that it is quite possible to make a monster out of a child. The most successful serial killers are the ones that can't be detected. November 19, Plainfield, Wisconsin. What kind of person was he? Well, he was a simpleton, but it was always assumed that he was completely harmless. He was a nice guy, just like everyone else. The only thing that distinguished him from the others, in my opinion, was that he was a little strange. He looked almost like a child, and his peers constantly mocked him, which was probably a consequence of the maternal paranoia that had established itself in him. Augusta was getting old, her health was weakening. Eventually, she had a stroke and died, and Ed's world collapsed. Presumably, from that moment, this movement of his began in a downward spiral, which eventually led him out of control. It is quite possible that this mental state was critical, which was aggravated by the circumstances that came after the death of his mother, when her death itself meant for him the loss of the most important person of his whole life. One of the characteristic features of schizophrenics, which can often be noted, is that they are completely indifferent to their appearance. This, in particular, was visible because of what was happening inside Ed's house. When the authorities entered the house, it seemed to them that Ed had changed the process of throwing out garbage to exactly the opposite. Namely, he went to the landfill and took all the garbage home. Ed's house was a symbolic image of what was going on in his head. A complete mess was going on in his head, and the house was just the physical personification of this mess. He had radios, although he couldn't listen to them because there was no electricity in the house. He kept old dentures everywhere. He had a huge collection of chewing gum. It wasn't all that terrible, but it was chilling nonetheless. For example, he closed parts of the house, completely sealed, boarded up the rooms. In these rooms, his mother's things were lying exactly in the places where she had left them. He himself lived in one of the rooms and in the kitchen, and that's all. Ed enjoyed reading books, newspapers, and magazines about people with different oddities and deviations. One of the interesting properties of the culture of the 50s was a large amount of dark sexual fiction. One of the most popular forms of periodicals were horror comics, for example, It's a Basement of Horrors, or Tales of the Crypt, and more. These were stories with an exciting plot and good vivid illustrations representing the extreme level of violence in the graphics. These comics were read not only by children, but also by adults. People were interested in another life, in the most diverse areas of its manifestation, in the most incredible representation. Full of pictures literally from the everyday life of the massacre, many materials were also published by itself, which described the crimes of Nazism in World War II. I myself remember what horrors all these pictures were, even those that were presented in the most widely read magazines, such as Life. These were photos from the death camps. It was also admired by stories about bounty hunters from the South Seas, stories about cemetery yards of the 19th century. Resurrectionists as such were called. Personally, it seems to me that this fueled the strangeness of his behavior. He became obsessed with such things, and eventually decided to put his obsession into practice. He started robbing graves. Gein said he started doing it about a year after his mother's death, suddenly feeling that passion overwhelmed him. Harold Schechter, author of the literary version. He went to the cemetery and tore up the graves of the corpses of middle-aged women, partly reminding him of his mother. He read obituaries, followed the funeral of some woman, went to the cemetery the night after the funeral. When the earth was still very fresh and had not settled, he dug out the coffin, opened the lid, and took out the body. Buried the coffin again, put the grave in full order, and took the body with him to do with it whatever he wanted. David told the Monster Show. The most important psychological trait of Gein was that he tried with all his might to get his mother back. He tried to dig up his mother's grave, but when he came to the cemetery, he found that he could not do it. Because in this part of Wisconsin, the soil was very sandy, and coffins were often placed in concrete basements. In the case of Ed Gein, Sigmund Freud could have found absolute practical confirmation of his theory. Ed both loved and hated his mother. Since he could not have a normal relationship with a woman, he wanted to take away from them those parts that were most closely related to the concept of femininity. With extraordinary joy and greed, he extracted more and more new parts of the bodies of the dead. He made himself a nipple belt. He cut out the genitals of women. Investigators found a box of dried vaginas, at least one of which was lovingly set in silver and decorated with a small red ribbon. He used the bones of a human shin to strengthen the coffee table. He took off the top of the skulls, scraped them out, and used them as tureens. He stuffed the chair with human skin. Most of all, of course, I was shocked by the suit made by Ed from human skin. He cut off the faces from the corpses of a woman, used them as masks. He tore the skin off the upper body of one of his victims and made himself leggings, and then began stitching together parts of the skin taken from various female corpses, creating a kind of Frankenstein costume. Gein was obsessed with the idea of various forms of transsexualism. Apparently, there was a part of him that aspired to become a woman. That was his own idea of a sex reassignment surgery. Obviously, he wasn't going to castrate himself, but he believed that he could achieve transformation by adding missing flesh and skin to his body. He would dress up in this horrible human skin suit and walk around his house pretending to be his mother. There was an ugly paradox at the center of Ed Gein's consciousness, because he was always trying to bring his mother back to the world of the living. despite the fact that this was the woman who oppressed and tormented him more than others, and he hated her. That's why he cut up these bodies and cut the skin in such a rage. There was no question of any patience and accuracy, but gradually there were not enough dead people. He went to a hardware store in the order, which was kept by a woman named Bernice Worden. It's clear now that something about Bernice attracted him, and that something was her distant resemblance to his mother. Gein had already visited the store the day before the tragedy, and was interested in the price of antifreeze. The next day, Gein entered the store and began to inspect the guns, then loaded a cartridge that he brought with him one of the guns, and shot Bernice in the back of the head. After that, Gein pulled Bernice's corpses out the back door, loaded them into the back of his pickup truck, and drove home. That afternoon, Bernice Worden's son Frank returned from hunting. He entered the store and was immediately horrified to find a rather large bloodstain on the floor. When the sheriffs arrived, the first thing they asked was who Frank suspected, and he immediately named Ed Gein. There was a very detailed receipt for antifreeze at the cash register. Several representatives of the law, including the sheriff, went to the Gein farm, and the first room they broke into was the summer kitchen adjacent to the house. The police knocked down the door and began to inspect the room and shine flashlights everywhere. And then one of them bumped into something, and when he turned around and shone his flashlight there, Bernice Worden's half-dismembered body was hanging there. Gein completely opened the body and gutted it. He performed the operation as it is usually done with roe deer. At the sight of this terrible picture, he recoiled and vomited. The police found Bernice's already gutted and washed body, but no entrails and head were found at that moment. Later, Bernice's insides were found wrapped in a man's suit. The heart was found in a plastic bag. Then one of the policemen came across an agate bag, from which, when it was opened, steam rose. There was a head in the bag. The policeman took the head out of the bag, and then, to the even greater horror of him and the others, it was discovered that Ed had stuck 2 large 10-penny nails into the ears of the head, having previously bent them with hooks. It was clear that he was going to hang his head as an ornament in his house. In total, Gein has 2 murders on his account, at least from those known to us. Bernice Worden, and the murder of a local bar owner named Mary Hogan, missing under very strange circumstances. It was previously clear that Mary had been killed because cartridge casings were found in her bar, and a strip of blood was also found reaching for the door. The case of Mary Hogan's disappearance, which happened a few years before Bernice's murder, was never solved at the time. Gein even joked about it, saying that Mary Hogan was hiding on his farm, which, of course, no one took seriously, attributing it to another manifestation of Gates' not very cheerful sense of humor. But during a search of Gein's farm, one of the policemen found a paper bag, took it and opened it. From the bag, by a bunch of hair, the policeman took out a face cut from the head, in which he and the others immediately recognized Mary Hogan. In the 50s in America, and especially in small towns at that time, people were in no way ready to learn about such horrors. What happened was created by a being from hell. The fact that Ed robbed graves struck the population even more than the murder, because it touched very, very much the primitive strings of the soul in them. It was shocking to hear that the bodies of their loved ones were being bullied in this way. One day, before it could be turned into a place of pilgrimage for tourists, a fire broke out on the Gein farm, the cause of which could not be determined, and the fire completely destroyed the house. The shock experienced by the angry residents of the town, obviously, was the cause of this fire. Plainfield was a town in the middle of nothing, cut off from any civilization. Even in Wisconsin, people have not heard of the existence of such a town. But suddenly, thanks to Gein's crime, the town became famous in a terrible way. Dozens of reporters were in town. The news of the crime was reported with great fanfare. In the end, Ed Gein got into the front page of Life. Then a big article appeared in the Times magazine. This was evidence of an extraordinary interest in the horrors of Gein. There were those who were in a hurry to take the opportunity to put their names in the newspapers and speak out on the topic, and, if they were more lucky, give their photos. But the sound social feeling of the residents of Plainfield was outraged by the terrible wound inflicted by Gale. Each small town was proud of itself in its own way. For example, that one or another celebrity was born in it. Plainfield has since immediately become known as the home of the worst psychopath in America. There is something that is not widely known. The concept of a serial killer came into use many years after this tragedy. Most serial killers were more or less mentally deranged. One could also call them terribly rational people in their own frightening understanding, without universal consciousness. Without a shadow of compassion, seeing in other people only objects that could be taken and used for their perverted purposes. It is impossible to have any sympathy for Ted Bundy or for John Wayne Gacy. They were just monsters. But even though Gein, thanks to his terrifying practice, was recognized as a complete and absolute monster, as you understand, there were also sane people, and there were many of them who felt a sense of pity and compassion for him. Without having previously experienced incredible torments of some kind, creatures like Gein appear, and they develop in the final form. Quite rarely. Gein, of course, was not schizophrenic in the usual sense. The disease of consciousness in most schizophrenics manifests itself at the age of 12, and Eddie was almost normal. Until the age of 39, when his mother died. And only after that began a chain of his terrible antics. As it turned out later, Gein was abnormal, which meant that his mental state was very, very painful. He often experienced various hallucinations: visual, auditory, olfactory. Then, some psychological details of his childhood and upbringing, the inability of a person to develop normally in psychosexual terms, became clear. In many serial killers, there is a little boy who acts under the influence of an instant impulse. Joseph Stefano, screenwriter of Psychosis. And civilization is called to take care of them and cure them, but no one knows that. In addition, I think that behind the crimes, there is also the fact of sexual satisfaction. Some men ejaculate the moment they kill their victims. Murder can be considered an extreme way of obtaining an extreme degree of pleasure at the cost of someone's life. One explanation for the fact that types like Ed Gein have such a fascinating effect on us is due to the fact that we are not able to resist them. Their crime is so terrible that our consciousness simply does not accept them. Perhaps they touch such primitive strings. This becomes the plot for classic legends and fairy tales. Everyone knows that there are special folk tales in different parts of the world. In folklore, this is called the bloodbath stories. These are fairy tales about, for example, a house where you never need to enter under any circumstances. In all these bloodbaths, what eventually turns up in these creepy places is a room full of dismembered bodies hanging on hooks. This is the victim of this or that monster, and you become its next victims yourself. Ed Gein was just a ghoul. Jen immediately became a hero of folklore legend. His image was digested in various forms. It was also a low-grade joke. What sweets does Ed Gein like the most? Ladies' fingers. What did Ed Gein say when the sheriff arrested him in My Heart Now With You in the Bag? It's not funny, but there were such vulgar jokers in Wisconsin in the 50s. There was something very clingy about Gein's story that could be repeated over and over again in all sorts of ways. For example, Psychosis became famous thanks to a book by the writer of horror novels Robert Bloch, who in the 50s lived in Wisconsin just when the story with Gein was thundering. In fact, if you have read Psychosis, then remember that after the arrest of Norman Bates, people there compare him to Ed Gein. The character of Norman Bates, created by Robert Bloch, is much closer to Ed Gein than shown later in the Hitchcock film. For obvious commercial reasons, Hitchcock decided to invite a well-known actress, a very attractive woman, to the film. According to the book by Norman Bates, this is a man over 40 who wears thick glasses and is not too attractive. It was simply impossible to imagine a person who could decide on such terrible crimes, which is why, most likely, he got away with it. I began to describe the character of the person that Norman Bates should be. Hitchcock smiled and asked Anthony Perkins. I exclaimed at the bullseye. Although Stefan broke up with an unattractive middle-aged man, who was Norman Bates, in my opinion, he created a very powerful icon. An ordinary guy neighbor scares much more. Psychosis. The film was released in the early 60s, but most of all the spirit of the 50s was conveyed by a book, reflecting this very rigid puritanical attitude of suppressing sexuality, and a lustful interest in various dirty reading material flashing against this background. This schizoid element, these parts of the Gein case, were used by Bloch and then by Hitchcock in creating Psychosis. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre did a great and profound job awakening the crypt atmosphere reigning in the Gein house. This horror and nightmare is pure and simple, and power comes from here, because you can't find any sense in it. Such a family of cannibals and bloody murderers simply cannot exist. But now you see them, and they are in front of you. We even feel a little compassion for the Leatherface. This is not a self-identification that we can experience when looking at a more or less normal kind of monster, like Norman Bates, performed by Anthony Perkins. The Leatherface family is probably an extreme parody of a cartoon or comic about an unsettled family. Therefore, we feel pity, and sometimes sympathy for the Leatherface, because we can imagine how it appeared. What The Silence of the Lambs borrowed from the Gein case is that famous human skin suit. In The Silence of the Lambs, both in the book and in the film, we watch Buffalo Bill reenact Ed Gein's crime. It seems to me very remarkable how serial killers become folk heroes of America. These people are doing things that we can't do, we can't even imagine. Or we can. The old proverb says that everyone has criminal thoughts. The difference is that we do not commit these crimes. A virtuous person dreams of what the villain brings to life. These people have stepped over fantasies within themselves, through these taboos, and this attracts us in an extraordinary way. This is quite exaggerated, but we can say that such people embody for us the freedom of the individual, which is the basis of the character of an American. They break the established rules, and for this we admire them. Gein became the germ of the image of a psychopath of our time. He is a creature that haunts us in childhood fears. It penetrates to us through the most primitive channels of consciousness. To peel the skin off another person's face and put it on your face is one of the most painful actions in human history. He has attracted our attention, and as long as attention is attracted, there will always be a place for Gein in modern culture. After his arrest in November 1957 year, Gein was subjected to a series of psychiatric examinations. The doctors concluded that Gein was mentally unfit to stand trial, and sent him to the Central Wisconsin State Hospital for criminals with mental disabilities. After 10 years, the hospital management announced that Gein could finally stand trial, and the case of Gein was reopened for the murder. He was found guilty, and was sentenced to life in a mental hospital. Ed Gein has adapted to life in a madhouse. It was said that he was an exemplary patient, kind, polite and calm. In the 74th year, Ed Gein applied for a revision. He was refused. He died in a mental hospital of pulmonary insufficiency on July 26, 84th year. Ed Gein is buried in an unmarked grave in Plainfield Cemetery, next to his mother Augusta. Produced and directed by Michelle Palmaro, produced by Jeffrey Schwartz, co-produced by Chris Sikorovsky.